Do you feel it? The weight of everything pressing down against your flesh as the universe cries out for your notice. All you can hear is the whistle of the wind. Do you feel it? Things have been changing, ever so gradually, until the very sense of your being is wholly unrecognizable. Your eyes cannot see it, but your mind can feel it. Do you feel it? And welcome back to Devlog. I made a water level. It's pretty good. The design for the water level is the aquatic abode, this being a home that has been flooded and is full of water. This made the design for the level significantly easier than any other design for levels so far, because other levels have taken place in more organic, curved environments, but for the aquatic abode, it can be in a more blocky level design. Designs for the aquatic abode is a interior location within a home that has been flooded with different liquids, these being water, poisonous water, and tar. A lot of the home has to look in a state of disrepair, but I will talk about that in the visual version of the devlog. This one is more about the level design. As you may have noticed, Pep-Pel has a focus on curved, non-blocky surfaces. So, why does this level have a blocky design to its areas? The reasoning for this is very, very simple. First of all, it's a water level, so the level does not have to have a curved surface design in itself because you are not really on surfaces for the amount of time you would be in the other level systems. So the level design itself being underwater means that there is no actual dependency on curved surfaces for the player to run on. The second reason being that based on the visual of the actual level, this being a home, the level should be a water level, because if I used the aquatic abode or the abode setting for another level that does not involve water, I would have to have a lot of blocky surfaces, and that would mean the design of Pep-Pel is not being utilized, this being that the levels are actually made out of blocks, which I want to avoid in my level design, because I find it boring. Another design I wanted for the aquatic abode is for all of the water sections to stand out from each other. This is done pretty easily. I just had the water made in a sense where it will actually cover most of the visual of the level. One technique I have for this is having a section of the water that is transparent and applies over the player, and then I have another section of the water that is transparent and applies over everything that is not the player. This means the player can fall into water, still be visually visual throughout going through the water, because they are only made slightly more to the color of the water, while the background is made a lot more intense for the water's color. This means the water has a lot easier time standing out across the rest of the visual of the level, because the colors are a lot more intense in obscuring the rest of the level, while the player can still stand out very clearly in the water's surface. The water itself is very difficult to plan around when designing a level, this being the fact that the water is actually made up of a lot of square chunks, but I had to obscure certain things like the surfaces of certain parts of the water. For example, there is definitely water at uneven surface levels in different parts of the level. You could start high up in the water, you could swim down, and you could exit the water at a different point, but I wanted to still have it so that the water makes sense in a logical sense, so you're not exiting through floating water blocks from the left or the right or the bottom, you're always exiting from the top of water blocks. This meant I had to design air pockets within the water, and this meant I had to get pretty creative with the actual visual design of the level, this being making the rooms in very odd shapes to accommodate for air pockets, or adding some level of the tar vines to obscure the ending of actual tar blocks. Realistically, all I need to do for this is make it so the ending of a block is always obscured. You can never see the left or rightmost sections of a water section, and you can never see the left or right of the actual surface of the water. These are always going to be obscured with the actual visuals of the level. Because if they weren't, you would just see that the water kind of just ends at a certain point. At this point you may be asking why I even made a water level, because they are all pretty universally despised by gamers throughout, and the reasoning for this is that you're wrong and you're stupid and you're bad and you have bad opinions. Water levels consistently rock. You are just wrong. I quite like water levels in games. I never particularly understood the disdain for a water level by gamers. The main reason I feel for this is because water levels generally feel a bit more sluggish to control, and here's a very simple tip for you game designers out there: just make the water levels fast. It's more fun. I have found the water level quite engaging in testing and playing. Ignoring my general enjoyment of water levels, I feel like making the water movement of Pep-Pel a lot faster really helps this system. The fact that the player moves quickly in water really makes water movement more fun for me. But also I feel like water movement in general has a lot more usage to be a lot more dynamic for the player. You can move in 360 degrees, where on the ground you could only move left or right. So it has a lot more options for movement, a lot more options for level design, and can make for some dynamic and fun level sections. I felt like the design of the levels just being big open rooms with water was obviously a little bit boring, so I drew and added furniture sprites to go inside of the water level. This is an obvious choice. The level is a house, there should be furniture. But I also felt that this was very interesting. The actual furniture themselves have unique hitboxes depending on the furniture. This means that when placed in water, or on the water surface, or on the non-water sections, they actually have a very dynamic movement for how the player moves across them. Tables are mostly pretty flat, so the player can run across them quite easily, but things like chandeliers, or an upside-down table, or a chair have a lot more complicated hitboxes, and therefore the player has a little bit of a harder time moving across them. Not an especially hard time, because Pep-Pel has dynamic and complex movement systems that accommodate for complex hitboxes, but it definitely is engaging for the player to have to climb over and maneuver across these furniture pieces. I feel like these help break up the actual blocky surfacing of the aquatic abode, these being the walls and roofs and floors of the aquatic abode are very blocky and square, and the furniture themselves are a lot more dynamic and interesting. There are multiple different furniture visuals for each of the different furniture objects that are within the aquatic abode, these being pillars, tables, longer tables, stools, smaller stools that are also wooden, and I don't remember what I called them, chandeliers, candles, dual candles, little wall dividers, piles of books, a chair, a cabinet, a bucket, I've forgotten what I have and have not listed at this point, and 2 potted plants that I forgot about until I made the level and then realized I had made 2 potted plant sprites and then never used them throughout the level, and now I just have 2 unused potted plant sprites in my files. Aside from the obvious visual choice of these looking nice in the level, they make the hitboxes, collision and difficulty of the level a lot more interesting. My favourite sprite is the candle holders. I think they look pretty and golden, and they have light emitting from them. Next I had to add new mechanics and gameplay mechanics that made the aquatic abode more interesting for the player. For if it is entirely water-based, I felt like this would not be engaging or interesting to the player. The first of these being the faller into water systems. This is a wooden plank thing covered in goop that when the player grabs onto it, it will eventually break free from its holding place and fall down until it hits the ground. This is very simple. We check if the player has grabbed onto it or is standing on top of it. If it does, we take a timer down. Once the timer is ticked down to 0, this object will fall. If it hits the water, it will create a splashing effect on the surface of the water in the exact same way the player makes a splashing effect on the surface of the water, and once it hits solid ground, it will stop moving. I in fact quite like how these work in gameplay. I think they add a lot of dynamic challenges to especially the later parts of the level, where the player has to hang on to one of these for a limited amount of time, but is in a situation where they are timed on how long they can actually hold on to one of these for, because it will eventually fall down. One of my favourite implementations of the falls into water is a system where I had to have the player grab onto the left side, wait for the faller to fall, jump over the top of it, fall down, catch up with the falling object, grab onto it again, and then jump off it for a different section of momentum boosting from jumping off the wall. This is a very difficult part of the gameplay mobility, and I assure you that all players will not enjoy this one section of the level. I then had an issue with the design for the pink water. This is water that the player can only spend a limited amount of time in. The issue with this is that I kept having to add frequent air pockets into the pink sections, so that the player would have a opportunity to not drown every 2 seconds when they are in the pink water. This made designing levels in the pink water very difficult because actually adding a bunch of air pockets and also a difficulty to poisoned areas was making areas not very engaging for the player. I couldn't really have a lot of dynamic, larger sections with the pink water because I had to have the player be able to frequently come up for air. My solution for this was just adding air bubbles that will move and the player can gulp like Sonic the Hedgehog, and this will reset the timer for actually drowning in the water. This is very simple. I have made the water drowning timer no longer in an I enumerator because those systems are awful and I hate, and I have just made an actual timer. I reset the timer once the player has gulped an air bubble, and I have the air bubbles create the air bubbles periodically, and these will accelerate and then fly upwards, popping whenever they collide with something or being gulped when the player gulps them. One interesting design I use for the air bubbles is having them float upwards and then run into a rotating hazard object like a buzzsaw. I think this is very interesting because it means the frequency of the air bubbles is halted by a hazard, and the player has to move past this hazard to be able to more frequently interact with the air bubbles. Finally, we have the saws that I added. I made this level the Path of Pain from Hollow Knight. I added a bunch of buzzsaws. I needed more dynamic hazard objects that were not just the spiky, vine, goo, tar objects, so I drew a bunch of buzzsaws. Why are they in the aquatic abode? I'll never tell. I think buzzsaws look cool, and I wanted them to be in this level because I thought they would look interesting with the ruined house. Maybe the house is being demolished as you are inside of it. Who's to say? But I'm a pretty big fan of how these actually look and work in level. They have a pretty interesting and threatening presence, so the player can very obviously see that these are a hazard. The visual for this I will talk in the visual devlog, but the center of these is a remaster of an old Gear visual I drew at the very start of this project. Finally, to talk about the actual level design, I have felt the level design for the aquatic abode has been increasingly easier compared to other levels. This is for a very obvious reason. When you're underwater, it's very easy to design hazards and mobility options because the player can move in 360 degrees, so I can just add more enemies or objects anywhere in the system because the player can swim into these or be treated these as a hazard. It is very, very simple to design underwater levels, and I am definitely seeing, even with the disdain for underwater levels, why a lot of games have them, because they are oh so easy to design for and very, very fun to design for. I can just place a bunch of weird little spiky objects in a fun trail and know that the player can swim around them very easily. I don't need to have any level of testing for these, even though I do test them, I promise, but in other levels where I may have to test a jump to make sure the player can dynamically jump through this, normally in the aquatic abode, if a hazard is underwater, I know logically the size of the player's hitbox, and I know logically what they will be able to swim through, so I can just add a bunch of hazards wherever I please and know that the player will be able to navigate through them. And that's how I made this devlog. In the next devlog, I will talk about the actual visual design for the aquatic abode, this being the visuals you are looking at. I like how it looks. I like the paintings the best. Do you want to know how I drew those? You gotta like and subscribe, otherwise I'll never tell.